Hello, my name is Dr. Joanna Kujava, and I'm the author of Alien Goddess. I am a tenured academic for the last 20 years, and I would like to call myself a spiritual detective. And my most recent book, Alien Goddess, and actually I have a card here from my publisher because the book will be released in a few days. I'm recording it on the 3rd of September for you, is about UFOs, AI, and the Goddesses of Ascension. So, to be honest with you, the core of my book is really about artificial intelligence and the dangers of artificial intelligence for our spirituality and for our lives. And I'm also looking in the connection of artificial intelligence with ancient mythologies, but also with UFOs. So today I would like to discuss the UFO connection just very briefly. And I'm going to speak about my own childhood experience, which actually happened to my friend and which I was able to verify as I was writing Alien Goddess. Then I'm going to briefly mention Chris Bledsoe's White Lady, what happened there. And then in more detail, I will discuss the famous sightings in Fatima, Portugal in 1916 and 1917. So please be patient. This is the first time that I talk about it publicly. And you can also watch out for interviews that I will be soon giving on other podcasts. So let's start with my childhood story first. I was not the experiencer in my childhood, but my friend was. We were two little girls. It was late 70s in Poland after the, still behind the Iron Curtain at the time. I lived in Poland then, now I live in Australia, in subtropical Australia. And one day, my friend from school, Ivonka, ran up the stairs and she said that she and her parents, when they were driving in a car to visit a family in a small town outside of our hometown called Lublin, that they spotted a UFO and it had orbs flying around it, and she described what she believed was a spaceship. And nobody believed her. I believed her because I thought it was exciting and she was my best friend then. But people were kind of making fun of her, but nobody was mean to her. So when I was writing Alien Goddess, and I just finished the middle part of the book, which is on artificial intelligence, I had this kind of intuitive thought, I don't know where it came from, but said, I suddenly remembered what Ivonka told me many decades ago about the sighting. And I almost heard this kind of thought in my head, check it. And I just got up from the table. I just was having a morning coffee with my family, and I Googled UFO sightings in Poland. And immediately a UFO sighting at that time, May 10th, 1978, in Emilcin showed up on Google. And apparently it is one of the very famous sightings. However, nobody really looked into this because everybody's talking about Roswell and more recent events, and also Brazilian events, because lots of documentaries were made about it. And people kind of forgot about Emilcin because it was then on the other side of the curtain, and now it just kind of got lost, right, in more current events. So I decided to research it because I wanted to verify whether my childhood friend's experience could possibly be true. And interestingly enough, there's lots of information, even in English, about Emilcin. So just to set the setting for you, we lived in a city called Lublin. Ivonka and her family were in a car driving to a small village, Konopnice, which is right in the middle between Lublin and Emilcin when the sighting happened. So it is quite possible that it could happen, that perhaps she observed what Jan Wolski, who was a Polish farmer who actually had this experience. So let me recount the story the way the Polish farmer described it, what happened to him. So it was very early morning. He was going to his fields in a cart pulled by horses. It was still very traditional then. And he was stopped by two short beings. And because we didn't see any foreigners, especially people in small villages didn't see any foreigners then, because we were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, he thought like maybe these are foreigners, which is very cute. He sees the short beings and kind of grayish looking beings, and he thought maybe they're foreigners, and so they stopped him and they asked him to follow them. So they were about 4.9 or so feet, according to him, and they asked him to follow him to their spaceship. And there it was hovering. There was what he called a flying object was hovering over the field. They lowered something like, not really a ladder, but it was a thing that helped him to go up to the ship. He noticed inside that there were no, that it was kind of made of one piece of something. He couldn't describe what it was because there were no joints. It was kind of grayish, blackish, and it was making a strange humming noise. And they asked him to undress, which he did because he was scared. And they inspected him. He didn't go into details how they inspected him, but they allowed him later to dress again, and they even offered him some nutrition. He said that it looked like some gray-looking icicles or something, but he declined. And then they lowered him in this kind of invisible ladder back to the ground, and they let him leave. So obviously he was shaken after this experience. So he jumped on his cart, pulled by horses, went back to his house, told his wife and told his sons. When he told them the story, they all went back to this place where he described this unusual encounter happened. And there was no spaceship anymore, but there was some burnt grass around this area and also like small feet moving in different direction. So later the same day, a 6-year-old boy in the neighborhood said that when the sun was rising, he saw also a flying object there that kind of hovered above the house and the barn and then disappeared really quickly. So this is John Wolski's story. But just to make the story even cuter, so to speak, nobody really made fun of him. And even now, as I was Googling it, I see that in the place where the sighting happened, there is a sign, and I'm translating from Polish, which says, "The truth, one day the truth will amaze you." So I think this is this is really good. He didn't fortunately experience any prejudice, but he was till the end of his life, he was adamant that this event really happened. He had this experience with these two strangers, and there were more strangers on the floating ship, so to speak. And his sons, when they came back there, they saw that there was some burnt grass and physical evidence, so to speak. So this really ignited my curiosity, because I thought this is quite possible then that my childhood friend Ivonka actually experienced the same thing, not to this detail because she was not on the spaceship actually, but she saw perhaps the same spaceship. So I just decided to explore this topic a little bit more. So once I thought I verified to a certain degree the experience of my childhood friend, and this experience by Wolski was very much a material form of experience. He believed that he was actually stopped by two beings and taken to a spaceship, and then he was allowed to leave after he was medically examined. And there was some physical evidence also after his sons came to check the place. I decided to investigate other sightings, and it was a very kind of organic process. And then I decided to focus on what happened more recently, which is Chris Bledsoe's experiences with the White Lady, because it will later lead me to the events in Fatima in 1916 and 17, on which I did a very thorough research, and I would like to share with you. And I know that many of you would be interested in this. So Chris Bledsoe is now a very famous figure in UFO community. He's also seemed to be in good relationship with everybody else, so to speak. I think the reason why I trust Chris Bledsoe, who by the way wrote his own book, UFO of God, it is because the events he describes are persistent. Not only it's persistent, he doesn't seem like a person who is particularly interested in fame, so he's not doing it for attention. He's not really a UFO researcher, and he also, more importantly, other people around him experience what we could call anomalous phenomena as well. So it is kind of verifiable also by other people. So Chris Bledsoe's experiences took place over a couple of decades or even longer. So one of the most famous experiences that he describes. It was when he was with his son, one of his sons, I think, and with his employees in the forest, and then they started to see these huge orbs, and they got actually very scared. However, when he started to share this information with other people, he experienced lots of prejudice and he completely shut down. So he decided that he's not talking about it. He's been ridiculed. He's been publicly ridiculed as man who claims to see UFOs and orbs and so on, and he decided he's done with it. It actually affected his mental health and so on. However, according to his new book and many podcasts, which you can check, around Easter 2012, I believe, his house was full of people because some friends of his children were staying over for a night. When he heard some noise in the middle of the night, he got up and a series of very unusual events happened. First of all, when I think he was led out of the house by some hooded figures, which kind of, for me, come from the liminal space. Liminal space is basically the space, for me, interdimensional space. So this is liminal space happens when we are kind of crossing a threshold from one reality to another, because this kind of reality is not completely physical, like in Wolski's case. However, it is very real to a person who experiences it. So he was led by these figures out of his house, and a series of very strange events happened, very kind of almost psychedelic experiences, although he doesn't take any drugs. First, I think as a kind of a bull started to run towards him, but in the air, and it was clearly some kind of interdimensional event. Then he was given a sort of white puppy look creature that was soft, and he could feel that it is alive, and he put it into a kennel. But when he came back later after series of events, it wasn't there anymore. So again, it is kind of in between realities, the whole experience. However, the core of his experience was when he saw, calls the white lady, that she appeared to him. She was again about the same size, maybe 4'5". She had long blonde hair and large eyes, and she had a very, very soft and feminine energy around her. And she told him, "You have to tell people what you have experienced." Something that he was really reluctant to do because he already experienced lots of ridicule, and here he is having another unusual experience. However, the figure of the white lady really stood up for me, and I made a mental note of this, which later led me to explore the events in Fatima. Then a similar event, but a little bit more developed, happened, I believe, during Easter 2013, when the same white lady appeared to him, but this time she actually transported him to some different landscape. He says that it looked like one particular place in Utah, and then she told him that a new wisdom will be given to humanity when the Star of Regulus faces the gaze of the Sphinx in Egypt, right? And apparently, Bledsoe's publisher checked this information with some astronomers who said that this will happen about Easter 2026. So we will know soon if a new knowledge is imparted to humanity, whether we are any wiser. However, it was very brave of Chris Bledsoe to share this experience with us, considering that he experienced lots of prejudice and ridicule before. But this is what he calls the white lady, the apparition, the anomalous kind of experience that he had, UFO-like experience that he had asked him to do. So he obeyed that. And the experiences, especially with orbs, and unusual anomalous experiences occur around him all the time in the place of his residence. And other members of his family experience it as well, especially his daughter, I think, and his son. So this is the white lady. So the white of Chris Bledsoe. And the white lady of Chris Bledsoe led me to the events of Fatima. Fatima is a small village in Portugal, and there were famous sightings of another white lady in 1916 and 1917, which is basically in the middle and at the end of World War I. But this part of my research was not very easy because it was very difficult to find legitimate information about what is now called the Lady of Fatima or the sightings of Fatima, because it happened such a long time ago and now everybody has an interpretation about it. And it has been also put very much in the kind of Catholic interpretation, which is, it was associated with the apparition of a Virgin Mary. So one book that I actually enjoy was by Hesseman, who wrote the book about it. And he basically did very good work compiling lots of information about the events of Fatima in 1916 and 1917. So, and he put lots of effort into it. So as a researcher, I kind of evaluated this book and I thought, yeah, I think I can trust the source, at least for initial investigation. However, he is a researcher of UFO, but UFOs from Germany, and also a Catholic journalist. So there will be some overlay of particular interpretation of the events as well. Yet at the same time, I do recommend his book as well. So basically, if we think about the what is called Marian apparitions, we don't know if it's really Virgin Mary or anybody else. However, this apparition is usually a female, white, kind of looking female, a little bit probably again in a liminal space, which is in between realities. And my interpretation of it again is that it's a multidimensional event, who has long blonde hair, large dark eyes, right? And she appears to people and small lips. And that she always exudes this very feminine and loving energy. So we can interpret it any way we want, depending on what we currently believe. So according to, depending whose research you read, some people say that there are around 360 apparitions of this kind in 20th century and 21st century, and as other people say up to 4,000. So again, it is an open book. However, we can see that this kind of apparitions do happen. This kind of experiences are real for people, whether they are of a material kind, like, for example, in the case of Wolski and Emilcin, or is it more of a more ethereal experience, more anomalous experience, like, for example, for Chris Bledsoe, it is for us to determine. So let's go with Hesseman's narrative. So in May 1916, 3 children near Fatima, it's a small village in Portugal, they are overseeing a herd of sheep, and at the same time they are praying, they're doing their rosary, because they are Catholics, and Portugal was very much Catholic at the time. And as they were doing it, they saw a little boy-like figure hovering above the oak tree there. And the boy said, pray with me, right? So they were praying even more, but the boy was very real to them, although he was again coming from almost like a different reality, right? Some liminal reality, interdimensional reality. After a few times when the boy appeared, different figures started to appear to children, and it was again a kind of white, what they called white lady, a feminine apparition, again long blonde hair, dark eyes, short, maybe 4.5 feet, and she was also hovering over the tree, and she exuded this very warm feminine healing energy. And she told the children that she will appear to them on the 13th of each month, which actually happened. So children kept doing it. They waited for the lady. Each time they felt very much embraced by her light. So they said when she spread her hands, they could see energy or the light coming out of her hands, and this beautiful energy embraced them and gave them this wonderful feeling, and they were completely transformed by this experience. And by that I mean that later, when people actually could observe the interaction with the white lady, or what they interpreted as the white lady, that their faces were transformed in almost like a religious or spiritual ecstasy. It was obvious that the children were experiencing something very unusual and something that was very uplifting for them. At a certain stage, the white lady told them that there will be she will show herself to many people, and their children should inform others that she will show themselves to other people as well, because she has some message for humanity, and that it will be in October 1917, and she gave a precise date and place, also near Fatima and so on. And the news spread very quickly because the experiences of children shared these experiences in their village. And it is quite interesting because there's a very kind of common assumption that Catholic Church made it up, but the Catholic Church didn't want to have anything to do with this, actually, which I found really interesting. And even the priest was telling children, don't, it's probably a fantasy, don't go there. But the children insisted that the experience was very real. So the news were spreading, and when the children said there will be like a big event in October of 1917 on the same day, about 70,000 people showed up on the field. And this is when it starts to be very interesting. So 70 people showed up at this field, including, obviously many people were there, but we know from the testimonies of these two people that also two people from a newspaper of Secular, which was secular paper, actually atheist paper, who wanted to come to this event because they believed that this is just stupid peasants or dumb peasants, as they said, interpreted something that is probably meteorological event in religious terms. So they went there to ridicule them. One of these people was a journalist for the paper, and the other person was a professor of social sciences from the regional university in that area. And they went there to basically ridicule the event and to tell people, come back to your senses, right? Come back to your reason. This is nothing. So as people were waiting in the field there, about 70,000 people, there was a very strong storm and everybody was wet because it was pouring and pouring, and suddenly the storm ended. It just stopped like that. And suddenly everybody, or nearly everybody, which is another interesting part, started to have this awesome experience. Just different people had different experiences. First of all, children again saw the white lady, and they were like transformed with spiritual ecstasy, so to speak. People saw who were around them on their faces that they were absolutely in some kind of religious ecstasy, a state, ecstatic state, and you can see ecstatics. But other people experienced different things. So first of all, most people believed that the sun started to spin out of control. Sun started to spin out of control and move back and forth and left and right and up and down. And other people said that it was not the sun, but there were like two separate suns that suddenly appeared and they started to zigzag on the sun. The two atheists, the professor of social sciences and the journalist from this secular paper or Secular, also had experiences. They said that the color started to change suddenly from dark damask to like amethyst, and there were like flying hats spinning around. They were also in awe. They just didn't interpret it in religious terms, the way, for example, the children did, but something extremely powerful happened there. And even these two guys who went there to debunk the whole event saw that something extraordinary happened. They just didn't know what happened, right? So I think it is really important when we discuss this kind of phenomenon, and usually would be called UFOs, or now they are called the unidentified anomalous phenomena, and I really prefer this terminology because it allows for multidimensional explanations or interpretations at least. We should take it seriously because even people who want to debunk it have an experience. They just wouldn't categorize it in as a spiritual experience, but they did have an experience, and definitely something was going on, right? Like people actually thought that the sun, or maybe even two suns were spinning, but another sun has appeared, and the colors change, and it was definitely an amazing show. It is quite interesting also that some people believed that in one of the suns, which I think nowadays would probably call the orbs, they saw actually three beings there, right? So that was something to behold, right? Even more interestingly, at that time people already had cars, so they were not common like they are nowadays, and some of the cars, like some engines of the cars, exploded. Okay, so there was definitely some physical event on top of a spiritual event that the children experienced that affected this kind of unusual behavior in the cars. And another layer to the story is that although, like, let's say 90% or 95% of people experienced something, there was a very small group of people who didn't experience anything. And later in my talks, when I talk about my book Alien Goddess, I'll get into it in more detail, because that's very important detail that actually, in my opinion, it explains the interdimensional aspect of the event. So this was amazing, right? Even people who went there to the banquet had experienced something that they couldn't explain, right? So they were just still making fun of the dumb peasants who thought that it was a biblical event, as they said, of biblical proportions, event of biblical proportions. They didn't think it was spiritual, but something really powerful has happened as far as they are concerned. So I enjoyed this research by Hesseman, and I thought he did a very good job on this. But I wanted to also check, being an academic, I started to look for on academia.com, where academics share their papers. I started to look for academic papers on the topic, and it was very difficult to find a paper that could be considered objective to a certain degree, because by then already it started to have so many interpretations. So, for example, the Catholic community said this was a definitely Virgin Mary, which is quite interesting, considering that they did live in a Catholic area. Portugal was very Catholic then, especially people in the countryside. So some people say children definitely just interpret it as a Virgin Mary because this is how they were brought up. However, interestingly enough, children didn't say originally that it was a Virgin Mary. In fact, I don't think ever said that it was a Virgin Mary. In fact, then I think in 1920, somebody created a picture of the White Lady, Virgin Mary-like lady, as an illustration for the events in Fatima, and they showed it to the surviving child. She said, and good Lucia, she said it was nothing like it was nothing like what she saw. So this was just a layer of interpretation that people in local area decided that it was a Virgin Mary, because it just fit very nicely the current beliefs, right? But the children said, no, it didn't look like that. It was different. It was a white lady. It had this beautiful energy, it was white hair, big dark eyes, and very warm and so on. But it was not that. So it's quite interesting, right? And so I decided to look for, is there somebody who actually has an objective description of this? And I decided on one paper by Philippe Dallaire, who wrote a scientific paper about the events of Fatima. How could you write a scientific paper? So basically, he compiled lots of pictures, because lots of pictures were taken during the event, and he decided to study the light in those photographs to determine a couple of things, like whether it was a meteorological event, whether it was a psychosis, so everybody basically got hysterical because they expected something to happen. Was it just unusual weather event, or was it something else? So he compiled as many pictures as he could, and by using mathematical equations, very high-level mathematical equations, which he provides in his academic paper, because it's a peer-reviewed academic paper published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, to show how he reached his conclusions, like by looking at the light on these pictures and what could cause this kind of lighting. So he reached the following conclusions. One was that it was definitely not psychosis, so it means it's not that people got hysterical. So it's not like nothing happened and people just thought that something happened. That was definitely not true, because the lighting on the pictures, on the photos, was very unusual. He also said that no meteorological or weather event could cause this kind of lighting. So it was another interesting conclusion that he reached. And he said that most definitely there were two sources of light, and he said it was not the sun, so it was not the sun spinning, but there were two sources of light, huge sources of light, very powerful sources of light, that made all kinds of movements, because depending on what picture, what photo he was looking at, and that had to move with amazing speed, right? So there are two sources of light that were moving with amazing speed, and it only could cause this kind of light and shadow combination. And he also noticed that the clothing of the people who were there, because everybody was originally soaked, because as perhaps you remember, I said that before the event there was an enormous downpour, a big storm which abruptly stopped. So not only the clothing on the people who were there, but also the cars, some of them exploded, had this kind of wet and dry patterns on them, which he believes could happen only when people or objects, any physical object, are exposed to infrared light. Okay, so he said there were two sources of light, very powerful sources of light that move rapidly, and also that there must have been some infrared light present there to create this kind of patterns on people's clothing and on the cars standing by. So that was a very interesting conclusion. So I think we could conclude that something did happen in Fatima. It was not a psychosis, it was not an imagination. There was some ephemeral element to this, but there was something physical going on as well, which was observable even for people who were there, people who went there to debunk the event, and also on the photographs themselves, which were scientifically studied. But I thought I would go a little bit deeper. And a friend of mine pointed me into an interview with a Portuguese UFO researcher, Correa, who gave an interview in English about these events. And he added another interesting piece of information. So, for example, it is from him I know that there was a small group of people that didn't experience anything, and I would explore it in another video. But he also said, and he said that he had a paper trail for this. The two different groups, psychic groups in Portugal, one was in Lisbon and one in another town, I don't remember the name of this town, were contacted by some entities that told them that there will be a very unusual event on the 13th of the month. And in fact, it was so important that humanity has to listen to this event, to the message that this event will somehow trigger for humanity, that both groups were so convinced that it is so important that they actually paid for advertisement in local newspapers to say, this is what you were told and something very unusual is going to happen. So that's why apparently there is a paper trail that this psychics got this information before the event, because they actually went into trouble to publish it in a local newspaper. So, so this is when I think we have to rethink the idea of UFOs only as technological events. And I think that they can be both. I don't want to disregard technological events. I just don't specialize in that because this is not part of my research. I specialize in different aspects of spirituality. This is where my research lies in. And then I personally, when I'm studying it, and I will share it with you later, I believe that there are interdimensional experiences, anomalous experiences, which also left some physical evidence there. So I think that perhaps what is normally called as UFOs is a form of intelligence that tries to communicate with us through the means of our consciousness, meeting us in liminal spaces where we have to cross the threshold of our own consciousness and we have to open our minds to a possibility of different event. Unless the event is so powerful, like for example, the event of October of 1917, that even two men who wrote about it, who went there to debunk it, had a very strong experience. They just didn't know what happened, but something definitely very powerful and life-changing happened for them as well. So this aspect of UFOs, I would like to explore more in the coming videos. And I also go into great depth to this in my book, Alien Goddess, UFOs, and the Goddesses of Ascension. And I really hope you check it out. And I would really like to know your opinion, because these are such interesting things. And lots of academics stay away from this topic because it is not considered legitimate topic. Only great figures, two people that I really admire in this area is, of course, Professor Diana Pasuka and also Professor Jeff Kripal, who write about UFOs in a very different way. So at this stage, I follow more in the footsteps of Professor Kripal, because I do, like him, I believe that it is more likely a kind of interdimensional event, although he probably doesn't call it exactly this way. But this is my conclusion at the moment. So I hope to see you later at my other recordings, and and I hope you check out my book, The Alien Goddess. Until next time, thank you.